What's up, everyone? Welcome to the Mixtape Podcast. I'm your host, Jason. Hope you're doing well. Hope you're enjoying the slow, gradual opening of things. So hopefully we'll get back to live music in a little bit. But on today's show is the host of one of the top Canadian music podcasts out there, Tyler Elynuik, from the Rave Drool Podcast. Tyler, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Not too bad, man. Yourself?
Cannot complain because things are slowly starting to open up. You know, the hope of live music is slowly getting there. So, you know, fingers are crossed that this is kind of like the end of all of this. Now, I am an unabashed lover of 90s Canadian rock. So to have you on the show is a joy. What prompted you, or what inspired you to start the Rave Drool Podcast?
Well, about 10 years ago or so, I tried to make a film about 90s Canadian music, a documentary. And I shot various interviews and over the years. And then up until a couple of years ago, I was continuing to shoot. And then I had some other people involved on the team trying to get this thing to the next level. We couldn't get over the hump to the point where money starts get kicked in to take it to the next level, right? Because you only do so much on your own. And then I figured, well, I have all these connections that I've made throughout the journey of trying to get the documentary made within the Canadian music industry, that it would be a shame not to let those go to the wayside. So I was thinking, well, there's things you can't do in a documentary interview that you can do in a podcast interview. There's a lot more personal stories that you can get from a guest, as opposed to talking about the bigger picture of something as huge as the Canadian rock scene. So this is using the podcast to get more personal stories about the band, members within the band. And then also the other goal is still to get a film or a short kind of episodic television series made. So I was thinking, well, if the podcast is successful and people, it's shown that people have an interest in this subject matter, that hopefully somebody can, will be interested in kind of completing the film portion of it, the television series portion of it. So that's kind of the goal of when I started the podcast a couple of years ago, just to not to let all these connections go to the wayside, and B, to try to get interest back into it, so we can ultimately get that film or TV series made, and give it a visual document as well as an audio document of the era.
Now, for anyone who wasn't around to enjoy the Canadian 90s rock scene, how would you describe it to them? Just super exciting. And super, if I was talking to somebody from another country, for example, or somebody who was, 20 years old now and who was a Canadian, I would just say that it was kind of the last era of the music industry as it was known for decades, because at the end of the 90s, technology changed in a way where streaming and Napster and, amalgamating of big corporations and things of that nature really kind of took the wind out of the sails in a lot of ways. The 90s was the last kind of opportunity, in my viewpoint, of just unabashed kind of creativity. And bands still had to earn their place. They had to earn a record deal. They couldn't just have a nice promo shot and put a song up on Spotify or YouTube or MySpace 10 years ago, and then get 1 million streams on their own or whatever. You had to earn your place. You still had to do the gigs. You had to be in a cover band, for example. You had to, do the hard work into to get to a point where record labels would take notice of you. And then, the 90s, specifically in Canada, it was so varied, with a lot of bands sharing. Like if you look at the Muchmusic countdown, for example, at any given year, you can get something like, straight up alternative, like a Rusty. You can get pop punk, like a Gob. You can get like a Celtic vibes with Great Big Sea. You can get Spirit of the West. You can get straight fiddle music with Ashton McIsaac, And then later on in the decade, of course, hip hop came with Northern Touch and Rascals, and then Len and Steal My Sunshine and Ragged Death, kind of rap metal at the early stages of that. So Canada in particular had a lot of variety and a lot of great music all kind of being made at once. And I think that's really indicative of the country, where, there's a lot of variety from border to border. And I think it was really shown in Canada during that 10-year span of all these genres kind of being able to to coexist at once. And then for the first time, in my mind, in my viewpoint, Canada's rock stars were created on their own, for example. I mean, they were Chart magazine where they could be on the cover of a magazine. They wouldn't have, Muchmusic, of course, took what they did in the 80s to the next level in the 90s. And then things like Big Shiny Tunes and Edgefest, where Canadian bands of the day could coexist with the top international acts of the day, and to show that, we're just as good as them, if not better. A lot of times there's an inferiority complex when it comes to, Canadians in general sometimes, or the music, like where they had to go in the States first and get big there first, and then Canada would accept you. Here it was the opposite in the 90s. You could get big here, and then go to the States, for example, like the Bare Naked Ladies, and get big there. So it was kind of reversed for the first time. And so to sum it up, I think just the excitement of a lot of different genres, and the creation of a star system in Canada, and a lot of things coming together at once that really made that decade special for a lot of reasons.
I love that you threw in there the fact that the Muchmusic Countdown did play, a big role in, the promotion of and discovery of Canadian music. And a lot of, that discoverability kind of went away when that national music video platform disappeared. From your standpoint, how important was it that Muchmusic, including the Video Fact Fund that was out there that would help, Canadian indie artists to get those videos made, how important was Muchmusic to, the entire national Canadian 90s music scene?
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely critical. I mean, I don't know about what kind of quotas they had. I don't know any of the politics behind it, but the fact that they played as much Canadian content as they did, and a variety of it, like they had, much east, much west, where they could look at different pockets of the Canadian country, different scenes. And then they had things like the Wedge and new music, where they would go for more indie bands or more bands with an artistic flair, nothing as opposed to a big kind of major kind of rock band. You can go for a band like Blue Dog Picked, for example, which I had in the podcast. They were on the new music, I believe. That was more of an underground kind of indie band that didn't get the video play or the video, treatment as well as some of the other acts out there. So Muchmusic was actually absolutely critical. And the fact that they could bring in bands in the environment, as they called it, for interviews or live performances. And then, of course, doing the interactives. And again, not just doing I&Is with, Blind Melon, but doing it with Moist and, the Tea Party, and, treating those, like I said, using the same kind of big platform, to showcase our music as well as anybody else's, even like the Muchmusic Video Awards. I mean, you had Our Lady Peace on there performing, and I Mother Earth and what have you, winning awards for best videos. And, like I said, it's just, it really helped to, like I said, legitimize music in a lot of ways where, you didn't have to, like a lot of people, even now, like I'll have a band on the podcast and people will make a comment somewhere in a message or a tweet saying, "Oh, I didn't know they were Canadian." And that comes down to things like Chart magazine putting, Rusty on the cover as the A story and Radiohead in the bottom right corner as the B story. Putting our music front and center, saying that, yeah, we're just as good as everybody else. And, it's about time we realized it.
Another big thing that Muchmusic did, of course, back then was, as you mentioned, the Big Shiny Tune CDs. And, basically having a very good mix of, the Canadian music. You'd have Moist on there as the same CD as Porno for Pyro. So you had a very good balance showcasing, the wide range of Canadian bands. But of course, nowadays, the idea of a compilation CD being that important, is kind of hard to fathom because of the fact that CD sales are down and things like Spotify have basically taken over the idea of, your music collection, if you will. Is it important, for someone or somehow to basically create a way to promote Canadian music again in that compilation style? And how do you think we can do that in 2021?
It's an interesting question. I haven't really thought about it, to be honest. I think that I don't think in a general, Muchmusic was a big force, as you mentioned. So, when they put their stamp on something,
and they promote it the heck out of it on television, every 4 minutes or, every 10 minutes, they have a bumper for a 30-second ad for the new Big Shiny Tunes record. The fact that there were still record stores you can go out to and see ads, and you could pick up the CD and you could turn it around and see the artwork and things of that nature. Now there's so many streaming platforms even. I mean, there's like 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 that, ways people get their music digitally anyhow. I think that if the right person or the right company got behind something like, Ryan Reynolds, let's say, for an example, or Seth Rogen. Okay, those are 2 Canadians who are of the same age that we are, roughly in 40s-ish. So they would have grown up with Canadian music scene in the 90s. So if they had put together something like, okay, here's my favorite 15 Canadian songs of the 90s, or of 90s, or even just the same quota and ration of American International to Canadian that Big Shiny Tunes did. So there's 4 or 5 Canadian songs that they dug from the 90s, and 5 American songs they dug from the 90s, or 7 or 8, or from whatever decade, really. I think that would allow the exposure, just because they can tweet that thing out to 25 million followers who all are hardcore, and they will retweet it out to their fan sites, the Ryan Reynolds fan sites and Ryan Reynolds Facebook groups that are out there. Something like that, I think, would be like the modern day kind of compilation thing that could give bands exposure and, really create the power of the playlist now, as opposed to the power of the compilation CD. I think it all comes down to so maybe if, Ed the Sock is trying to get like another music station going. So if something like that took off, he is a, bit of a platform, and, 10, 20,000 followers, something of that nature, then maybe, but, a guy like myself, 30,000 followers. It's nothing, I'm grateful to have each and every one of them, but it doesn't exactly have the sway that, Much Music had back in the day, with millions and millions of television sets across North America, really. Cause people's pockets in the States would get Canadian television to a certain degree. So I don't know. I think it would come down to like the power of, individual people making playlists and compilation playlists. I think, if I just had to think of something at the top of my mind, which I just did, that's, maybe after retrospect, I come to a different viewpoint, but that's the first thing that kind of popped to my mind is just the power of celebrity now, and the way celebrities interact with their fans now. I think that if a celebrity took on, that thing where every year they released, their big shiny tunes. So every year, Seth Rogen or Ryan Reynolds around Christmas time release their Big Shiny Tunes is playlist. I think it's something that, and if they built up, kind of a marketing strategy ahead of it, a couple months ahead of time, it's coming. And, that kind of attitude, something they could do for free. They don't even need to shoot commercials or anything like that, but just tweets and Instagram posts. And I think something like that would be the modern day equivalent to that would have the power that, something like a Big Shiny Tunes had back in the day.
We need Deadpool to save the day in this case.
That's right. And he's a Regina boy. Deadpool. So Regina, Saskatchewan. So
but the interesting thing too, because of course, in the 90s, television was, everyone was looked at their TV, right? They they were, had a cassette in the tape deck recording off the radio, or they had a VHS tape in the VCR waiting for their favorite video, Much Music. But nowadays, of course, the amount of time people spend actually sitting in front of an actual television to watch something, as much as I would love to see Ed the Sock get his network, and I think he's doing it right by going with an online presence, is the idea of it, and of course Much Music is kind of doing their thing now with TikTok, which that's a bit of a whole thing kind of thing. But is the time right for, some company to create what Much Music used to be? And I'm not talking about the crazy, we're going to aim at the short attention span, youth demographic. I'm talking about the days when you had JD Roberts and Erica M and Christopher Ward actually talking, doing proper news about Canadian music.
Yeah, I think that's it might not last as a whole dedicated channel to it, but if you had something like,
maybe I was going to say
Hollywood Suite or something. Go ahead.
Or a rehashing of video hits on CBC.
Well, yeah, I really think, I'm of the viewpoint where if they, I don't know how much it costs to get the channel on the go with all the regulations and stuff. But I'm of the viewpoint where if Bell just launched Muchmusic again and just played from episode 1 all the way through, from whatever it started in the mid 80s, the full every day that they started back then, they just played all the content that they could get relicensed or whatever. Cause I don't know how much music licenses and things of that nature. It's all very complicated legal stuff, but if they just put like that on from point 1 and just replayed all the old programs, I think you would still get audience, but now to get like a brand new thing on the go, I think that maybe if you did like, if there was some sort of station that was like, 4 hours a day, it's this, 4 hours a day, it's that, 4 hours a day, it's this, for a 4-hour block, you would have the old kind of people within the round, people within the studio talking to people. Or I guess even if you just did it by Zoom calls and stuff like that, but then you had like, you still had the performances and the conversations, something like that might work. But I'm not sure about a whole, like you said, because people don't really watch TV anymore. But if you had like, 4-hour block where some people could look forward to it every day, they would tape that 4-hour block to see like, okay, half hour of that 4-hour block's the wedge, half hour that's the new music, half hour that's just video flow, right? Half hour that's this. I think that you could find an audience for, is you PVR that thing and you could watch it whenever you want. You could pile them up and, and then binge watch them at some point and fast forward to the stuff you don't want to watch, right? I think something of that nature, but like a 24-hour a day video channel, I think might be a bit of a tough sell, like you said, in this kind of climate. But like I said, if they just played old content, though, I think I'd be watching.
Let's get back to your documentary for a second here. We saw the effect that the story of Anvil documentary had on kind of a resurgence of that band. And you see, a number of these bands that would do so well if someone just shone a light on the music that they are still great, because there are bands from that era that are still together and still putting out great music. Who did you have? I'm just curious now, who did you have that you had lined up for your documentary? And is there a band or two that you would love to see kind of get the Anvil treatment and basically have a career resurgence, because a documentary shone the light on them?
Yeah, I had interviewed anybody from, Todd Kearns from Age of Electric to Danny Graves from The Watchmen to Alan Cross to Bruce McDonald, director of Hardcore Logo, to Sarah Harmer. I had an interview for the documentary, and so a bunch of people from kind of different walks. And then as far as bands, I mean, there's just so many. I mean, like I just put it in terms of like wanting to see bands I always wanted to see a follow-up record from. I put it in terms like that, like a band like that I really think hit their peak with one album and then was kind of gone afterwards. Like a band like the Gandharvas, for example, Soul for a Smile. I think that everything they had been working up towards with Soap Bubble and Inertia and Kicking in Water was finally coming to fruition with Soul for a Smile. Where they would still have their elements that made them unique, but they still had more of a, they refined the songs a little bit tighter, they had big choruses. And then that was it for them. That was their last record. And, I always wanted to know what's, I think I read I don't know if this is true or not, if it's my own mind playing tricks on me, but I think I'd read an old article saying with Paul Jago, the lead singer of Gandharvas, saying that there was another record written. And then it never got past the record label's desk because the Backstreet Boys are now like the thing, right? So it just got stuck in a drawer somewhere. So I always wanted to know what that record would have sounded like. If they would have had continued with the kind of sound they had refined, the Soul for a Smile, and taken that to the next level, or had they reverted back? Because they really had a lot of interesting things going on. What would a third record with Edwin and I'm on the Earth have sounded like? How would that have differed from what Brian did with the band with Blue, Green, Orange? Yeah, things of that nature. I mean, a band like Mully's Revenge made one record, one major label, and then they broke up right after, and it was just Eve Adam. So I always wanted to know, and they had an interesting sound too, because they had like a cello player, and there's just so many to really sum it up quickly.
Of the episodes that you've put out of the Rave Drool podcast so far, has there been one interview where it was, so far a highlight, like if you had to like literally hand someone one episode of the Rave Drool podcast of the ones that have been released so far, which one would you hand them in order to kind of give people a good idea of what to expect from the podcast?
I think I would start with the, everybody's been great on the podcast. Everybody's really been, the candor and the openness that everybody's given to me and to the listener is phenomenal so far. But if you had to like sum it up to one, I would go with the Grant Lawrence episodes, just because he's such a phenomenal storyteller and there's so much wit that even like a band like the Smugglers they weren't Our Lady Peace, for example. They weren't that level of success. I mean, they did well. They were Mint Records, Lookout Records. They were, they had a nice little career in that. But you can take a band like that and, that you might not even be familiar with, and then be engaged by the storytelling and by the adventures that this small band that you might not even be familiar with went on, as opposed to like the Watchmen, who a lot of people are familiar with, right? So they'd be more interested in hearing the Watchmen because, I remember buying their 4 records, but as opposed to Smugglers, maybe they didn't buy their 4 records. So I think you could start there, just because the storytelling that he does is so phenomenal. He's so funny. He has such great memory. And then that's really when the podcast kind of came into its own, because he encouraged me to include more music in the episodes. And so for the first time there's a lot of music. So like he's talking about the Gruesomers, for example. And, so we kick to a Gruesomes track. He's talking about Cubs, we kick to a Cub track. If he's talking about a band, a song about the Smugglers, then we'll kick to that Smugglers track. So I think that's really, an episode I'd showcase, just because he's so good on it. He's such a great storyteller. I mean, he hosted a brilliant podcast forever. He does work on camera for CBC now. And so he's so comfortable behind the mic and telling those stories that it'd be really good kind of gateway into what this kind of podcast is.
And maybe that's kind of the the opening, as far as opening up the eyes to the Canadian music scene, is that CBC has such a platform that they have kind of ready available. Do we need a CBC backed or some kind of Sirius XM, like straight up can rocks from the 90s, like because there's the Lithium. If you've listened to Sirius XM, there's Lithium, which is like all 90s alt rock. Do we need the Canadian version of Lithium?
Yeah, I think it'd be brilliant. I mean, I don't see why, like you said, I don't see why not. If people have the power to put something on that's, that's not focused on Canadian music, then they got to have the power to put something on that is focused on Canadian music of a specific decade. And like you can run through them all. I mean, you look at all the 80s stuff. I mean, you look at all the stuff that Took is kind of reigniting the interest in by releasing albums of covering their favorite 80s songs, Canadian 80s songs. It just amazing songs too that that I didn't know of, because it wasn't really my decade as much as the 90s were. But bands that I'm learning about through the podcast, like Strange Advance, for example, from the 80s, that I really the Trevor Hirsch was talking about being a fan of back in the day, that really influenced the Econoline Crush. So I think if you found like music stations dedicated across the board, 70s, 60s, 80s, 90s, it'd be brilliant. I think that's a brilliant idea. I think that you should absolutely do this.
Now I can't remember. I can't remember who it was on CBC, but you had one of their reporters, doing a throw while wearing a Rave Drool Podcast T-shirt. So how important?
Yeah, that was Grant Lawrence. So great Grant Lawrence. Yeah.
How has it been? Like the reception to the Rave Drool Podcast?
Yeah, it's been great. I mean, we're not breaking any download records or anything like that, but the audience is steadily growing. I think we've been heard in over 60 countries, which is, I don't know if those are all expats or those are people finding the podcast through somebody like a Todd Kearns, who has a big international following because of his work with Slash. So maybe they listen to his episode and then they want to check out some other episodes, right? So I'm not sure who within those countries is listening to him, but I know it's been listened to there. And then, most of the people have reached out to us. I mean, I think I've only had maybe 1 or 2 people say no, just that they're kind of past that chapter in their life, which is fine. Totally understandable. But otherwise, I think people have been really engaged in participating in it. And the fans have been, I don't call it the fans of that music, not the fans of the podcast, just the listeners of the podcast, but the fans of the era, as I am. Like to get really engaged. I mean, I try to engage people as much as I can on Twitter and Facebook with, various questions that I retweet from Eric Alper, or, Throwback Thursdays, or, things of that nature, or, what do you remember this, or name a 90s Canadian song that has this in it, just to kind of see the answers, and then people see the answers, and then like, oh yeah, I forgot about that band. And, they have side conversations going. So I think that the sense of community is really been one special thing that's come out of the podcast. A lot of people who you kind of find one place to congregate, people who have burning questions like, oh, I remember this video had that in it, had this, had that. Can you help? And if I don't know the answer, then I post that on Facebook and somebody will have the answer. And they're like, fine. That's been burning me up for 10 years. I finally know what that is. So things of that nature, and the sense of community has been really the blessing that's come out of this whole thing, is aside from showing, giving these bands time to tell their story and showcasing the music, it's the community that's built around that that's really been special, I think.
If you had the opportunity to put together and release a Rave Drool, kind of a discovery CD for your favorite, Canadian 90s bands, not necessarily, picking which songs, but which bands would you want to have on a Rave Drool compilation CD?
I don't know. It's tough to exclude people just because, everybody's so great. I'm trying to remain unbiased, if you will. But I've always thought about that.
It could be a box set.
yeah, exactly. Let's do a box set. And then everybody who's not mentioned here will know that they're within that box set. Exactly. Good call. So, I mean, bands that meant a lot to me when I was younger was a band like, Our Lady Peace, obviously. Was a big band for me back in the day. Like I was telling Jeremy Taggart off air, I don't know if he made the podcast, but like he may be one of the most air two drummers that, I air drum the most to him, maybe of all the people out there, him. And, he was definitely one of them anyways. There's a few, of course, but, a band like Glue Leg, I remember, getting busted trying to sneak into one of their gigs, so a song like Pistons still means a lot to me. A band like Mullage Advance has a personal connection that I hope to get it on the podcast someday, but I can't seem to track down a contact for the lead vocalist and songwriter. But I remember, I just recognized them at a gas station one day. They were on tour in Regina, and I was like, oh yeah, she had a distinct look and stuff like that. So I just started up a conversation. I was like 17 or 18 or something like that, 19. And, she ended up putting me on the guest list that night, and I went to the gig and I was blown away, because I'd never seen him live. Boy, I had seen him live open for Moist at the exhibition or something, like at the fair, but I had never seen him in a club before. And I was just blown away, blown away by the Gander Hours and Hollywood Island nightclub, blown away by the power of both of those performances, and then of course you try to, if I was going to make a compilation CD, like I said, earlier in our chat, that's I try to have a lot of variety in it, like a Spirit of the West or a Great Big Sea, like a Rag of Death, or if we were talking straight can rock and no hip hop or anything like that, like then you get like a Rag of Death in there for the kind of hip hop crossover element. And then you get like a Steal My Sunshine or Drinking in LA for a little more of a dance element, or a Sky or a Prozac or something like that. That's still not straight hip hop, but still has a rock element to it. Then you'd have the singer-songwriters like a Ron Sexsmith, you have in there, you have like a Chantal Kvyat, you'd have, like in Halifax, it would have to be represented like an Eric's Trip or a Hardship Post or a Sloan. Eric's Trip's Moncton, but if you catch my drift, the East Coast anyhow. So just be try to make as much variety as possible, and try to make it flow as well, where there's a good combination of, slower tracks, ballad-ish stuff, and then straight up rockers where you could have, straight up party tunes. It's tough to nail down to 12 tracks. I don't know how you could put it on a vinyl or a CD, but box set is the way to go, I think.
Seeing as many live concerts as you have, is there any band that's out there that is kind of on the bucket list that, when things start to open back up and live shows start to happen again, if they're touring through your town, you are going no matter what, because you don't want to miss another opportunity?
Yeah, Jesus. The only thing I think that I've seen everybody Canadian that's at one point or another in my lifetime, not recently, mind you, but at one point in my life, I've seen all the Canadian acts that have been on the list. I was talking to an American act who, I don't know if he really tours anymore, to be honest. He hasn't released a record in like 10 years, but
a guy named Dax Riggs, who was in a band called Acid Bath back in the day, but now he does solo work that's the antithesis of Acid Bath. I mean, it's, Acid Bath, like the sludge kind of New Orleans metal stuff. And then now he does like singer-songwriter-esque stuff. And so he was somebody that's, he's always been on my bucket list to see because he's one of the top vocalists in the world, in my opinion. But he'd be one I'd travel to see, if he's playing in Austin, Texas, or something post-pandemic. He's somebody that wouldn't come into my town, but I would travel to see.
Now let's switch gears here for a second here, because you have really put it out there that you are trying your damnedest to get Mike Vernon
That's right.
elected into the Hockey Hall of Fame. So Indeed, I mean, I don't think we need to sell anybody on how good Mike Vernon is. But for you, what's the driving motivation?
We do need to sell him on it. That's my point, because he's not in the Hall of Fame. You understand? That's what we do need to sell.
I mean, we're talking like a 2-time Stanley Cup champion, a
that's right.
5-time All-Star. We're talking a Jennings Trophy co-winner. Like, what is it? Like, what's the driving motivation for you to get Mike Vernon into the Hall of Fame? And B, what are people, in your opinion, missing the boat on with him?
It's an interesting thing. The reason why I'm trying to stoke the flames, as if you will, is he was my favorite hockey player growing up. I mean, I was a goalie growing up, and I remember distinctly like shedding a tear when they lost in '86 to the Canadiens, and they would win 3 years later. But he's always been my favorite player. Always left his style. He's a little guy, big glove hand. And like you said, he won. I mean, he won in 2 different places. He won in Detroit, Calgary. He should have won 2 Conn Smythes. In my opinion, as good as McInnes was in '89, they don't get there without Vernon. They don't win the series. They don't get out of Vancouver Game 7 in '89 first round without Mike Vernon, and then he continued his run throughout. And then and it's weird. People find I search like Mike Vernon on Twitter just to find out, because there's a lot of people who know a lot more about hockey than I do, and people who just are hardcore stats people that post things all the time. And then the other thing was, they were saying that if Marc-Andre Fleury would have won his 10th game this year, he would have been in a club where currently only 8 people eight goaltenders have won 10 or more games 4 different years in the Stanley Cup playoffs. There's 8 goalies who've done it so far. 7 are in the Hall of Fame. Guess which one isn't in the Hall of Fame? Mm-hmm. Mike Vernon. And little things. He's like, and I don't know. Like, I don't know how, at least locally, there's always politics involved. I mean, even at the minor league level, there's, an old boys club. But I think it's just, maybe you just didn't. I honestly don't know. I mean, I don't know what they're missing, to be honest with you, because the stats are all there. And to do it like 5'9", 175 pounds, he wasn't a big guy. The numbers you look, his goals against was this, his save percentage was that. Yeah, look who's in his division for most of the year. Gretzky had his fucking peak. He was in the division for like first 10 years of his career or something. It's like, yeah, of course he's going to like have an inflated GAA and save percentage. But I really don't know, because even Lanny McDonald, the only reason Lanny McDonald has a cup, or one of the reasons, not the only reason, of course, but was because he was on the '89 team with Mike Vernon. And Lanny McDonald was like president of the Hockey Hall of Fame selection committee. So if Lanny McDonald, theoretically, they got to be boys. They got to, unless they had some beef or something that nobody knows about. But like, how do you not sway the room, Lanny? I mean, you're in there, my man. Like, I don't know.
When you're a fan of a player, if you're a fan of a team, players come and go. But when you're a fan of a specific player, you're almost ready for them to, not every player is a Steve Yzerman who's going to spend his entire career with one team. Even players like Daniel Alfredsson spend time with a second team. Mm-hmm. And of course, splitting his time primarily with Calgary and then Detroit. But how weird was it as a fan, to see that little blip of time with him with Florida? Do you equate that with the time, that brief, flicker of time when like Gretzky was with the Blues?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, yeah, exactly. Comparison is right on point. Because San Jose, I think he was there for maybe 2 years, and Florida half a year for like a playoff run. And like, yeah, it's weird seeing him in like a Florida jersey. San Jose, because he was there at least over a year, 2 years at least, because they went through 2 different at least kind of jersey styles. But Florida is the real outlier there. That's like the St. Louis situation, because Gretzky would be New York was equivalent would be San Jose, New York Rangers and San Jose for Vernon. And then of course, LA, Detroit, Calgary, Edmonton, those would be the equivalents. And I must say, at Mike Vernon NHL on Twitter is the Twitter handle for the Mike Vernon Hall of Fame campaign. But so yeah, the Florida ones is a St. Louis situation for sure. I mean, you look at old photos or hockey cards, he has like the San Jose gear for the most part, and the Florida jersey, the blue jersey, and yeah, it's weird. It's weird, but I mean, and also you didn't really get to see him. I mean, because Florida, I mean, we didn't have as much hockey access back then in the late 90s, early 2000s. You didn't have, networks and streaming and YouTube, so you couldn't even see him really. See him on the highlight packages. Detroit, at least you still got to see him because we had like Detroit TV and stuff, and they were an original 16, which still got on, Hockey Night in Canada a lot more often. So, but yeah, you couldn't even see him when he was in San Jose and Mike Vernon, so you just have to follow him far and look in the paper and stuff like that. So yeah, frustrating, but hopefully he ended up, I'm just so happy, ended his career in Calgary, retired as a Flame.
Now,
not just ceremoniously, actually played and retired as a Flame, not just for one day or what have you.
Now, I do have to let our listeners know that we are recording this conversation on the 2 days away from the beginning of the Stanley Cup Finals. Of course, with the Habs becoming the first team in a long time to at least Canadian team to make the Stanley Cup Finals. So, as a hockey fan in general, how important is it if the Habs win the Cup this year? Because it's been 28 years since a Canadian team has lifted the Cup.
Yeah, I mean, it's massive. I mean, sure, the majority of the players in every Stanley Cup winner are Canadian. That's just a statistic. But when you have an actual Canadian team, just because we have now we have 8 chances to do it every year. Before it was like 6 or 7, and just facing those odds in general are astronomical, and some not astronomical, but they're difficult. But then you saw the reaction the country had to the Raptors championship win a couple of years ago. And you see how it can unite a country, and people who aren't Canadian fans but are hockey fans, like you said, who are Canadian, are rooting for them. I mean, I'm a Calgary Flames fan, as you probably guessed, but every year I root for every Canadian team against the other American team. Don't know who they are. Canadians beat my Flames in '86. They were one of the rivals. Patrick Roy and Vernon, always a rival, but I'm still nonetheless rooting for them 100%. And I think it's just a unifying thing having a Canadian team in a final. Just unifying. When the Blue Jays did it in like the early 90s and the Raptors recently, just a countrywide thing that's unifying, I guess, because even, like I said, 20, 30 teams in the States and then, 5 in Canada. I mean, 5, 6, whatever the numbers are. Not that, obviously, but yeah, it's just a unifying thing. And I think it's really special to witness and be a part of, especially now with social media and all the cameras everywhere. It's really, it's really nice for a lot of these people who haven't experienced that through hockey. Because at least the last time anybody won was 93, I think. And I can't remember the last time Calgary Edmonton was in the final, but it was fairly recently. 2000 or something. Yeah,
that was like 2006 for Edmonton against Carolina, and then it was the 2004 with the Flames against the Lightning, of course.
There you go. And when the Flames and the Lightning, I mean, you remember that with the Red Mile and all the people going nuts in Calgary. And
oh yeah,
and that you see that on a national stage. I mean, that makes the news, not just the hockey game itself, but the reaction to the hockey game and the support that community or that city is giving them.
I do have to point out, and having watched that 2004 series very closely, Calgary won Game 6.
Yes, thank you.
They
going on record. Appreciate it. Yeah.
That puck was in, right?
100%.
Like that's I mean, you saw it on the zoom up. But then I think there's another point too, as far as the Mike Vernon thing goes. That yes, Mika Kiprusoff was a very important goalie for the Calgary Flames. Holds all the regular season records, but Mike Vernon is still the playoff, like all-time record holder, as far as pretty much every goaltending record as far as the Flames go.
Mm-hmm. Oh, exactly. I mean, and again, you can't just, I mean, Mika had those numbers too because of the way that the coaching and the more teams in the league means each team is watered down with talent to some degree. I mean, back in the day when you only have 25 teams, you're getting, but now when you add 5 more teams to it, that's 100 more players spread out across. So, so the coaches and have to coach more defensively and, with more systems in mind that they didn't have to do back when, when Vernon was in the, 80s to mid 90s or whatever, not until really New Jersey took the, the system thing and went nuts with it, with the trap and all that nonsense. But yeah, exactly. I mean, there's one guy's jersey's hanging on the Raptors right now, and one guy's isn't. You know.
Okay, so I'm going to put it out there as an either or question here. Okay.
Yeah.
Better Canadian artist hockey song, The Hockey Song, Stompin' Tom, or Gretzky Rocks from The Pursuit of Happiness.
Ooh. I think even The Pursuit of Happiness would probably say The Hockey Song, because it's the hockey song. I mean, it's the one. You know, Gretzky Rocks is rocks. It's awesome. And the Hanson brothers made a bunch of great hockey songs too, with No Means No members and whatnot. But yeah, I mean, you got to go with the original. There is no hockey song unless it's the hockey song.
Okay, so I want to get to young Tyler here. Okay, do you remember the first time with your very own money going to a record store and buying an album for yourself?
I do, actually, and I still have. I don't remember I don't remember the whole experience, but I remember the album. And you remember when CDs came in really long boxes because they still had the racks from records in stores, and they hadn't figured out how to re-merchandise CDs. So this one I bought with the long box on it, and I still have the long box somewhere. And it was Straight Outta Compton by NWA. And that was the very first CD I bought with my own money. The very first CD I played was Digital Underground Sex Packets that I borrowed from my buddy. So I played that. It was the very first CD I ever played. And the very first CD I ever bought was NWA Straight Outta Compton in the long box.
Which of course brings us to the big question of the podcast that everyone gets. So it's time, Tyler.
Okay.
If you had to introduce yourself to a total stranger, but instead of saying, "Hi, I'm Tyler, I'm from the Rave Drool Podcast," you hand them a mixtape, and on that tape are songs that tell the story of you. What songs are on that tape, and why are those songs there?
One track, probably "I'm Going Down" off Born in the USA by Bruce Springsteen, because of a childhood memory. My mother had back surgery, so she was in the hospital, but I still had a baseball tournament in North Dakota, so she was recovering. And me and my dad drove to the baseball tournament, and we listened to Born in the USA on cassette tape the entire way back and forth, like Williston or Minot. So "I'm Going Down," I think, or "No Surrender" off Born in the USA. And then I'll go with something off "To the Extreme" by Vanilla Ice. I won't go with "Ice Ice Baby" because everybody's heard "Ice Ice Baby," but I'll go with "Stop That Train," which was another single off the album, so people might know it. But I remember dancing to that song on my little tape player when I was about 10 or 11 or something. And then go on to, what's that, high school-ish, I would say maybe like "Daughter" by Pearl Jam, just because that was my first exposure to them. Was in high school, you catch rides with people to school all the time, and you listen to what they listen to, and some guy had verses, and I had heard the other stuff, even Flow and Alive and stuff like that. But previous to me driving with that guy, I was driving with the guy who was a country music fan, so I was exposed to country music like "Ain't Nothing Wrong with My Radio" by Aaron Tippett, or "Honk on Bobo" or something, or Chattahoochee. But I would go with "Daughter," Pearl Jam, and then I'll go with something like a track called "This Time" by Life of Agony, which the reason I picked that song is because somebody had left a mixtape in my car or my friend's car, and we were listening to the mixtape, and there was one song on there that nobody knew who it was, right? We would play it for people whenever we went to the parking lots. Who is this song? Who is this song? Who is this song? And that song ended up being "This Time" by Life of Agony, but it was like a big kind of music search for me early on. And if you look at some of the Canadian stuff I mentioned earlier, I'll go back to it, like Glue Leg Pistons, just because I remember trying to sneak in to see Glue Leg and getting busted. And, Our Lady Peace, just I remember, it's probably something off Superman's Dead, just because I remember, trying to sneak into one of their gigs as well, when I was 18 and they were only 19. So go with something like that. And maybe, like I said, Dax Riggs, which I mentioned earlier, a track called "Death Bright," which is off his first solo record underneath the name Dax Riggs. He had done a couple things, previous to that. But yeah, and then the last thing I'll go with was I'm trying to keep it as much non-Canadian as possible because I don't want to seem biased and leave anybody out. And also, people get my Canadian vibes on the podcast all the time. So I'll try to go something that's not mentioned on the podcast very often. But two more. One would be 59 Sound by Gaslight Anthem, because that was a band that's I discovered the day they were playing here. And then I went to the gig and was blown away and bought the record. And then I'll close with
to tie back into the podcast, I did my first special presentation, I call it, on the Rave Drool Podcast, where once or twice a year, I'm going to do something where I'm going to introduce people to music that I love that doesn't really get that much play, or that I don't, in my opinion, doesn't get as much attention as it deserves in a place like Canada or the US. So that would be Steve Harley and Cockney Rebel, which is a guy from the UK who made his first record in 73. And he's like my favorite non-90s, non-Canadian artist of all time. And so it was just a privilege to talk to him for a few hours. So I've made that into a 2-episode podcast. And so if I was going to pick a track by him, I would go with Tumbling Down, because that was one of the tracks I first ever heard by him, because there was a film called Velvet Goldmine about glam rock in the 70s. And the character within the film sings a couple songs as his own. And one of those songs is Tumbling Down by Steve Harley. So that's kind of my first exposure to him.
Tyler, thank you so much for this. Where can we find the Rave Drool Podcast, and where can we find you on social media?
Before we get to that, I just want to apologize, because you said it's live on tape that I ramble and I don't. You sound like a legit radio person. I am not.
Oh, dear God. I am the furthest thing from a real radio person.
You sound legit. I am stumbling and bubbling through the whole thing.
I have a face for radio. Listeners. I have a face for radio, so I apologize to anyone watching this on YouTube. But where can we hear Rave Drool, and where can we find you on social media?
Yeah, Rave Drool is on all podcast platforms. So even if you just search the keywords Rave Drool Can Rock, 3 keywords, you'll find it there. And then we're at Rave Drool on all social media. So twitter.com/Rave Drool, Instagram, Rave Drool, Facebook, Rave Drool. And then we also have a companion playlist on Apple and Spotify to the podcast. So if people want an exposure to 90s Canadian music without listening to an episode, I suggest you just follow the link in any of the podcast episodes. There's links at the bottom to an Apple playlist and a Spotify playlist. Click that, click random, and you'll check out Canadian music without having to listen to my voice on the podcast.
Well, thank you so much for this. And to our listeners, go check out the Rave Drool Podcast. You are in for a great time listening to these interviews. Tyler, thank you so much for swinging by. And thank you all for listening to this episode of the Mixtape Podcast. If you're listening to us on an audio streaming service, you can watch me and my Made for Radio face on YouTube. This entire interview is there. But if you are watching us on YouTube, I'm sorry, but you can then go to any of the audio streaming services and download it on the go. Spotify, iTunes, TuneIn, Good Pods, we're all there. So have a listen, download, listen to us on the go wherever you want. This is the Mixtape Podcast. I'm your host, Jason. We'll see you next time. Take care.